The scar on Louis Armstrong's hand was faint but permanent. He'd gotten it in 1919, during the first year of his marriage to Daisy Parker, when a domestic argument escalated into violence and Daisy came at him with a straight razor. Louis was 18 years old. Daisy was 21. They'd been married only months. And in that single terrifying moment, the flash of the blade, the sting of the cut, the blood on his hand, Louis got his first lesson in what a relationship could become when two damaged people with no models for healthy love tried to build a life together in poverty and chaos. He would not learn from that lesson quickly. The marriage lasted 4 years. 4 years of mutual violence, jealousy, screaming fights that woke neighbors, police calls, and a pattern of behavior that Louis would carry with him into his next 3 relationships before. Finally, with Lucille Wilson in 1942, learning a different way. This is the story America doesn't know about Louis Armstrong, not the genius, not the innovator, not the smiling Satchmo, but the teenager who married a woman who attacked him with a razor, who stayed in a violent relationship because he didn't know what else to do, and who spent decades unlearning the template that first marriage created. The story of Daisy Parker and Louis Armstrong. A love story in the way that some terrible things are love stories, real, damaging, formative, and impossible to forget. New Orleans in 1918 was a city of contradictions. Jazz was being born in its streets and clubs, a music of freedom and improvisation emerging from a society built on rigid racial hierarchy and brutal poverty. The neighborhood called Storyville, where Louis had grown up singing for coins and watching prostitutes work and learning to play cornet from musicians who came in and out of his life like weather, was being shut down by the Navy Department. The world Louis knew was changing, and Louis himself at 17 was changing too, playing in clubs, developing his sound, becoming known locally as a gifted young cornetist, but still young, still unformed, still very much a child in the ways that mattered most. Daisy Parker was older. 20 when Louis first noticed her, working as a prostitute in the same neighborhoods where Louis performed. She was beautiful and confident and experienced in ways Louis wasn't. She had a fierceness about her, a combination of pride and volatility that Louis, who had grown up around strong women but few stable ones, found compelling. Daisy had survived things, had developed an armor of toughness that Louis, with his tenderness and his music, simultaneously admired and found alien. Their courtship was brief and intense. Louis pursued Daisy with the single-mindedness he'd later apply to music. She was elusive, unpredictable, sometimes warm and sometimes cold in ways Louis couldn't predict. But he kept coming back, and eventually Daisy, perhaps seeing something in Louis's persistence and talent, agreed to marry him. They wed in 1918. Louis was 17, possibly 18. Daisy was 20 or 21. Neither had family structures that would have modeled what a healthy marriage looked like. Neither had resources. Neither had any real understanding of what they were agreeing to. The marriage began in the way that many marriages between young, poor, traumatized people begin, with genuine feeling and completely inadequate tools. Louis loved Daisy in the way you love someone when you've never been shown what sustainable love looks like. Passionately, possessively, without the emotional vocabulary to negotiate conflict or express needs or maintain connection through difficulty. Daisy loved Louis probably in similar terms, intensely and destructively, and without understanding how to translate feeling into partnership. The violence started early, arguments that escalated. Louis's temper, which he usually managed, but which poverty and stress and jealousy could unlock. Daisy's temper, which she managed less well, which could shift from warmth to fury with a speed that left Louis unable to anticipate or de-escalate. They fought about money, which they didn't have enough of, about Louis's music, which took him away from home constantly, about Daisy's past, which Louis was jealous of in the complicated way that men who pursue women with histories often are, wanting them and resenting what they want, about other women who watched Louis perform, about other men who watched Daisy. The razor incident came within the first year. The details are murky. Louis discussed the marriage in interviews throughout his life, but was never fully specific about individual incidents, perhaps from privacy, perhaps from shame, perhaps from the complicated loyalty that abuse survivors sometimes maintain toward their abusers. What's clear is that Daisy attacked Louis with a straight razor during an argument. The cut on his hand was the physical evidence that this was real, that this had happened, that the marriage he'd entered with hope and desire had become something dangerous. But Louis didn't leave. This is the crucial and heartbreaking part of the story. The razor attack would have been justification, in anyone's accounting, for ending the marriage immediately. Louis was physically assaulted by his wife. He bore a scar from it, and yet he stayed, 4 years total. Why? The answers are complicated and reveal something important about how cycles of violence work, about what poverty and limited options do to choices, about how young people who grow up without models of healthy love don't know how to recognize or escape unhealthy patterns. Louis stayed partly because he didn't recognize the relationship as abnormal. He'd grown up watching volatile relationships. His mother Mayan's relationships had been unstable. The neighborhood he'd come from was full of couples who fought loudly and physically and stayed together anyway. Violence wasn't considered incompatible with love in the world Louis had grown up in. It was just something that happened, something you managed, something you maybe caused and maybe absorbed, and either way didn't necessarily end a marriage over. Louis also stayed because of genuine feeling. Despite the violence, despite the chaos, he cared about Daisy. Their relationship had good moments, moments of laughter and connection and the physical intimacy that had drawn them together in the first place. Louis was young enough and romantic enough to believe that those good moments could somehow be made permanent, that the violence was something they could move past rather than a fundamental pattern of how they related to each other. And Louis stayed because leaving required both logistical capacity and psychological permission that neither he nor Daisy had developed. Leaving requires believing you deserve better, requires having somewhere to go, requires understanding that what's happening is not acceptable rather than just difficult. None of those conditions were fully present for Louis in 1918-1922. He was young, poor, without family support, in a culture that treated domestic violence as private matter, in a marriage to a woman he cared about who sometimes hurt him and who he sometimes hurt back, because the violence was not entirely one-directional. Louis, when confronted with Daisy's attacks, sometimes responded with his own physical aggression. The picture that emerges from the limited accounts available is not of a simple victim and perpetrator, but of two people locked in cycles of mutual violence, each capable of harm, each capable of warmth, neither capable of stopping the cycle without more insight and support than they had. This complexity is important, not because it excuses anyone's behavior, but because it reflects the reality of how domestic violence often operates, especially among young people without resources or models or vocabulary for healthy conflict. The marriage attracted community attention. Neighbors heard the fights. Other musicians knew about the volatility. In the small world of New Orleans music circles, Louis and Daisy's relationship was talked about. Some people told Louis he should leave. Others shrugged. Relationships like theirs were common enough. Police were called occasionally, though in 1920s New Orleans, police involvement in domestic disputes rarely produced meaningful protection or intervention. Louis's music career was developing through these years, and the relationship existed in tension with that development. When Louis played well, when audiences responded, when musicians he admired acknowledged his growing talent, Louis felt a kind of peace and rightness that he couldn't find at home. The trumpet and the music became a refuge from the chaos of his marriage. The stage was safe in ways his home wasn't. When the opportunity came in 1922 to join King Oliver's Creole Jazz Band in Chicago, leaving New Orleans and therefore leaving Daisy became possible in practical terms. Louis accepted. He moved to Chicago. And though the marriage didn't immediately dissolve, Louis and Daisy maintained some contact for a period, and Louis sent money for a while. The physical separation allowed him to begin the process of extracting himself from a relationship that had taught him wrong lessons about love. The divorce from Daisy came in 1923, 4 years after their marriage. Louis was 21 or 22. He'd spent a quarter of his life in a relationship defined by love and violence in equal measure, and he was free, or thought he was free, because the template that 4 years with Daisy had created didn't dissolve with the divorce. Patterns don't end with legal documents. The blueprint for how Louis related to women built in those 4 years would persist. His second marriage to Lil Hardin, the pianist in Oliver's band, was less physically violent but had its own turbulence. Louis's third marriage to Alpha Smith ended after 4 years, the same duration as the Daisy marriage, as if Louis were repeating a cycle he couldn't see. The relationships were different in their specifics, but the pattern of intensity followed by rupture, of genuine love combined with inability to sustain partnership, echoed the Daisy years. the legacy of the first marriage extended beyond Louis's romantic relationships. The razor incident and the 4 years of volatile partnership left psychological marks that shaped how Louis understood conflict, how he responded to challenge, how he managed his emotions. The swagger and confidence Louis projected on stage coexisted with insecurities and reactive patterns that the Daisy marriage had installed. He'd learned to survive, hadn't yet learned to be well. It took Lucille Wilson, his fourth wife, married in 1942 when Louis was 41, to finally offer something genuinely different. Lucille had her own strength and history, but she brought to the relationship an insistence on dignity and accountability that none of Louis's previous partners had maintained so consistently. She established expectations and held to them. She wasn't interested in cycles of violence or volatility. She offered stability in exchange for fidelity and respect, and Louis, old enough finally to recognize what he'd been missing, accepted those terms. The 29 years with Lucille, the longest relationship of Louis's life, lasting until his death in 1971, represented the completion of a long journey that had started with Daisy Parker and the razor in 1919. A journey from a teenager who didn't know what love should look like, through 3 failed marriages and multiple patterns of dysfunction, to finally learning how to be someone's partner rather than someone's antagonist. But Daisy Parker was the beginning of that journey, the marriage that taught Louis what he didn't want, through direct and sometimes bloody experience, the relationship that established patterns he would spend decades trying to break. The woman whose razor left a scar on Louis's hand and a deeper scar on his. Understanding of what intimacy could become without models and resources and the emotional vocabulary to do it differently. In 2026, we have language for what Louis and Daisy experienced that didn't exist in 1918. Trauma bonding, cycles of abuse, intergenerational patterns of violence, the research on how childhood environments shape adult relationships. The understanding that leaving an abusive relationship is psychologically complicated, not simply a matter of deciding to go. None of that knowledge was available to Louis or Daisy in New Orleans a century ago. They were working without maps in territory that was destroying them both. What happened to Daisy Parker after the marriage ended is largely unknown. She disappears from historical record once Louis moved to Chicago. Unlike Louis's subsequent wives, Daisy left no interviews, no letters, no documented legacy. She was a young woman in New Orleans in the 1920s, poor and black and without connections that would have made her historically visible. She existed in Louis's story as the first wife, the violent one, the cautionary tale, and then she ceased to exist in the historical record at all, which is its own tragedy. The story of Louis Armstrong's first marriage matters because it complicates the icon. The smiling Satchmo whose music brought joy to the world was also a young man who got cut with a razor by his wife and stayed anyway, who sometimes hurt and was hurt in return, who carried the wounds of early love badly done through decades of subsequent relationships, who needed 4 tries and 24 years to finally figure out how to be a partner rather than a combatant. That complexity doesn't diminish Louis's genius, but it humanizes. It shows the person behind the trumpet, the wounds behind the smile, the journey painful, long, often going in the wrong direction that eventually brought Louis Armstrong to the stable partnership with Lucille that would sustain his life and career until the end. The scar on his hand from Daisy's razor, faint but permanent, a reminder of where he'd started, of what he'd survived, of how far he'd traveled from that apartment in New Orleans where 2 young people who didn't know how to love each other tried to do it anyway and left marks on each other that lasted a lifetime. Louis Armstrong's first marriage, the story he didn't fully tell, the beginning he spent the rest of his life moving away from, the razor's edge of love gone wrong, and the long road back to something better.